Hello there, and welcome to this first tutorial for the C# Intermediate tutorial project for the Stride game engine. In this tutorial, we learn about setting up UI interactions and the very basics of dealing with UI elements in the Stride game engine. At first, we'll do this by setting up a UI page inside the editor, and later on we'll do everything sort of in a similar way, but entirely by code. So if we start our project and we go to the start scenes, we'll open up the UI interaction and you'll see that we have this scene looking at those boxes right here, but there is no UI other than the default UI to switch between various tutorial scenes. Once we've completed this tutorial, however, we will have created the UI on the left, where if I would type my name, then this text block below is automatically updated with my name and some additional text. And if I clear this text by pressing this button, we'll learn how to set that up through code. But we design our UI elements inside the Stride Game Studio UI editor. And in the bottom here, we see show me the time. And if we click on that, then we get the time printed out onto the screen. This UI, however, is set up entirely by code. Let's start by opening up the proper scene first. So we go to our asset view by going to scenes, the basics tutorial for the UI, and then we click Start UI Basics. As you can see, this is where our camera is looking towards to, and that means that we now have to start making our UI page. We do this by clicking on Add Asset, and if we type page, then we get the UI page option. I'm going to call this UI demo, and once it's saved, I'm going to double click it so that it opens the UI editor. Now to the left, at first we see a couple of basic UI elements like buttons, editable texts, sliders, scroll bars, and much more. Right below that, we have the visual tree or the hierarchy of UI elements that are currently in our UI editable page. Currently, there aren't any, but we do have a grid, which is sort of a container to, well, a collection for all the UI elements that we have, and it displays them automatically in a grid. There are other types of, well, visualizers like a canvas or a stack panel, but for now the grid view will do just fine. So let's first talk about what exactly is a UI page. You can see that as a collection of, well, UI elements that sort of fit together. So when you start your game, for instance, you have a main menu with a start button, some options, an exit button. You could fit those in a nicely made UI page. They all serve a similar purpose. But if you have some sort of RPG game and you press I to open up the inventory, you would open up a page containing all sorts of options to add swords or other armor to your character. All those UI elements would fit in a nice page as well. Now this is entirely up to you how you organize this, but that is basically the functionality of a UI page. So with this grid currently selected, let's first make that first project where we have an input text and an label text where our name is going to be printed towards to. Let's start with that. And since we're going to make two pages, one by editor and one by code, I'm going to scale this grid that we have here for our view somewhat to a half. It doesn't have to be very accurate for this tutorial. So with that grid still selected, let's first add in a edit text. And if we select it here in the UI library and we drag and drop that onto our UI canvas, notice how we get this edit text, which is currently filling up the entire grid. We don't want that. We want a relatively smaller editable text block. I'm going to scale that down a little bit and I'm going to drag that upwards. So this is our edit text, and we could actually start typing in text if we wanted to, but for now, this'll do. So to the right, we have a properties grid. Just like with the scene editor, every object or UI object that we've added to our scene will be visual in this visual tree. And once you select one of those UI elements, you get all the properties of this UI element. Now at the top, we can see that we can add some default text, which would appear as soon as we start the game. But for now, all these options, they're not quite relevant to us. Of course, we could design this edit text to look differently, but right now the only thing that I'm interested in is this miscellaneous option here and then the name property. This allows us to set the name of this particular UI element. Now, if this is just some static UI element that you do not want to interact with, then you can just leave this name empty or just leave it the default value that it has. But since we want to reference it through code, it's best to give it a proper name. So I'm just going to call this my edit text. Now that we have this edit text, we also want to add another UI component, which is the text block. I'm going to drag that in as well. Notice how I dragged it underneath the edit text because that was the last UI element that was selected. But I don't want that. I want them on the same layer, if you will. And since it is a text block, it doesn't have any, well, visuals, if you will. It's just a transparent grid or a transparent panel, if you will. So just to make it a little bit more visible, I go to the appearance section and I'm going to go to background color. I'm going to give it a slightly yellowish color. There we go. And the text alignment, I'm going to set that to center. And then for the name, we're going to change this to my text. There we go. And as soon as we update that name, notice how also the name is being updated inside the visual tree to the left. Going back to our start scene, we can display the page that we've just made by adding a UI component to an entity. So I'm going to create a new entity, and we'll call this UI editor. And then to the right, I'm going to add a component. And if I type in UI, you will see I have this component called UI. And this is a built-in component of the Stride game engine. And this allows me to reference a page that we've actually just created. We can see that here. The first property is a page, and it doesn't have an asset selected. So we can drag in this UI demo page that we've just made. As soon as we do that, as you might notice, we see that UI appearing on our screen. And this is great, especially if you want to design or get a feel of what your UI would look like through the eyes of an actual camera looking into our scene. If at any point you find this UI to be a hinder or you just don't want to see it, you can check this checkbox here and it will disappear for the moment. Now that we've set up the UI component and our base UI page, let's first start the game and see what happens. So if we click UI interaction, then we have the UI that we've just added and we just can start typing here. I'm going to say that is my name. I guess I could scale down this box just a little bit, but that's not really relevant for now. What we want to do next is make a script, and we tell that script as soon as we start typing inside this edit box that we're going to display some text here, something like my name is, and then the input of this input box should be added to that text as well. So that's the first thing that we're going to do right now. I said I wouldn't do so, but I'm just going to make this slightly smaller. There we go. go. Save up the project. So let's create a new script. For that, we're going to go to the code folder inside our Solution Explorer. We're going to select the UI Basics folder. As you can see, this is the completed code. So if you want to have a quick look, you can open those. But we are going to create a new asset. And if we're going to type in script, we're going to make a startup script, because a sync script would be updating our scene every time or every frame we would get an update, and we really don't have to do that in our case. So a startup script will do, and we're just going to call this UI editor demo. There we go. And now we can open up Visual Studio. We open up the UI editor demo, and the first thing that we want to do is include the namespace that we need when we start working with UI. So we're definitely going to need stride.ui. And then we're going to add in a couple of variables that allow us to reference those text blocks and those edit text blocks. So for now, we're just going to say, remove this comment line here, go away. We're going to say private text block, my text, and still don't have enough namespaces included, it looks. So if we look at these suggestions here, it says using system windows.controls. We don't need that one. Apparently system windows controls also has a similar namespace which contains a text block element, but we need the Stride UI controls namespace. So we're going to include that as well. And then we're making a second variable, and this is the edit text, and I'm going to call this my edit text. There we go. Now let's first get a reference to that page that we referenced in the UI component. Now the component that we're currently in, or the script we're currently in, we're going to add that to the same entity that we've added the UI component to. And as we've learned from the C# beginner tutorials project, in order to get a component, all we have to do is say entity get, and then the name of the component, which is UI component, of course. Come on. And once we've retrieved that component, the only thing that we want to know from this component is the page that it references. Of course, we could store the actual reference to the UI component itself, but we really don't need anything else right now. So storing the page for now is more than enough. Let's start with the my edit text, because that's the first object that needs to be found. We can find that in page root element, and then if we type in find, then we get various methods that can help us find our UI element. One of those is called find name, and between the parentheses we can fill in the name of our edit text. I believe this is what it was called, and once we find it, we get back a generic UI object. If I put my space right here, notice it returns a UI element, but we've specifically declared a private text block UI element, so we need to cast it to an edit text. An alternate way of doing this is with the my text variable, page root element again, find visual child of type, and then between these blocks we have to fill in the type of our UI element that we're looking for, and then again we have to provide a name. So we're going to say my text, but this time we don't have to cast it, as this method is already doing that for us. So use the method that you find the most comforting or that suits your programming style. So now that those two are referenced, let's set up the actual event that says, hey, the edit text field has been edited. Now let's update that text block. So we're going to say edit my edit text. If we go to the text changed event, we can add our code here. So we can do two things here. We can create an inline method or an anonymous method, if you will, or we can create a separate private method that we can reference here. And for this first example, let's create an inline method. So we have said as soon as there's a text change, that's an event. Now all we have to do is say who is sending this, and then the inline method, I forgot the lambda here. What we want to do is update our text block, myText.text, and that's going to be a custom piece of text. We're going to say my name is, and then we're going to add that my edit text.text. So if I would type in my name, it would say my name is followed by my name. There we go. So let's see if this works. We're going to build this project first. Let's set a breakpoint. And if we go back to Stride itself, all we have to do is go to our UI editor entity. And if we type in UI, then we have our custom-made component here, UI editor demo. Let's save our scene. I'm going to go back to Visual Studio. And if we launch our game from Visual Studio, we will be able to trigger that specific breakpoint. We load up our start scene UI interaction. We set our cursor inside our text box. Notice that this hasn't really changed the text box values, but as soon as I start typing my name, boom, this breakpoint is triggered. And this is great because this is exactly what we want. The myEditText.text, it contains one value, and that's the letter J. That's the first letter of my name, and that's exactly what we want. So I'm just going to remove this breakpoint, and I'm going to continue the game, and I'm going to continue typing out my name. And every time we type, our text field or label or text block, how you want to call it, is being updated. So this is working great. The next thing we're going to do is add a button through our UI editor and then set up another event, but this time for the button, which clears our text field, if you will. So we're going to go back to the Stride engine or the Stride editor. We're going to open up our UI demo. And this time we're going to add a button. It's filling up the entire page. We don't want that. I'm just going to have a simple button, drag that to the middle, somewhat here. I'm going to click the text here, which is an interesting thing because the button itself actually exists out of two different UI elements. The button itself, which is the clickable part, and as you can see, it exists out of several images, like a mouse over, a hover image, and a pressed image. And you can specify your own textures here if you have them, or you can use the default Stride buttons for now. And as a sub UI component, there is this text block, which is similar to the text block that we used up here, but it's just being utilized again for this button. Now we don't have to name this text block itself because we're not going to reference it, but we are going to change the default text that it currently has, and we're just going to say reset name. Now the button itself, we are going to reference that. So it's useful if we give this a proper name, my button. Now we don't have to use the name, we could use an index as well, but that's just kind of complicated, and if we would delete objects, then it just makes a mess out of things. So I would just recommend using the name property of such a UI element. Let's go back to our code. We're going to be referencing this button, but first we need to find it. So we're going to say page root element find visual of type. This time it's a button, and it's called my button. That's how we just named it. There we go. And if we say button.click, which is also again an event, we can use a different style of setting up an event. So as you recall, up here, this was an inline event, but we can also create a private method which we reference. And Visual Studio actually has a nice shortcut for this. You can see if I press Tab to insert it, it will create this method for us, and all we have to do is give it a proper name. I'm just going to call it button clicked event. And it has this private method with all the specific parameters attached to it as well. And from here on, we have a different way of programming. Use whichever one you prefer. Some people like to use these short inline methods, and other people like to use these methods. They both have their ups and downs. But let's first do something with the button now being clicked. So the first thing that we could do is say edit text, or actually this my edit text dot text. We're just going to reset that to nothing. And the next thing that we want to do is my text itself. It should get some sort of default value, like a couple of dots. So let's save this again and give it another spin. We click the UI scene again. Notice how we are directly getting an error. And it says here, object reference not set to an instance of an object, which means in our case that the button that we tried to get here doesn't exist, or it could not be found. Notice that my button here is spelled with capital casing. But if we go back to our editor, we go select our my button, and we see that in our name, it's actually called with a lowercase name. So I'm going to correct this for now to my button so that we have the proper casing. Save our scene again, go back to the editor. We want to stop our project, just simply start it again. Let's load up the scene again, and this time we actually can start doing something. So if I would type my name again, if we click this button, then now our name is being reset. Great. So now we've learned how to set up a basic UI page by drag and dropping in various UI elements, how to retrieve those elements from the page that we've referenced through a UI component, and then we learned two different ways of writing up an event for those text elements. One was the text changed event for the edit text, and the other one was a button where we added functionality to the click event. Now let's move on to the second part of this tutorial, where we're going to create an entire UI page entirely from scratch.